Um, my next talk actually starts from the beginning, so I'm going to have to come back to that stuff. I'm going to say some things that, I think I don't think they're that controversial, but they're sort of shocking. And that is that I believe that opioids have contributed substantially to the initiation and perpetuation of disability in workers' compensation systems. This is not that well known. And and that's not the only thing that's contributing. Bad spine surgery. 44% of our patients who had a lumbar fusion 10 years ago are totally disabled, total permanent disability. Have you ever heard of failed brain surgery syndrome or failed heart surgery syndrome? There's only failed back surgery syndrome. This is insane. I noticed a building somewhere close to here that was a laser spine institute. It is fancy. That's all those injections and all this stuff that is being done to injured workers, and a lot of those folks are also on opioids. So it's not just an opioid problem, it's a multiple intervention problem of some of the worst care in America. Our workers are getting bad care to a large extent, partly because we're probably not really incentivizing great care. So that's on us, that's on the insurers to do that kind of stuff. But there are bad docs out there taking care of a lot of our injured workers. We have a guy we're looking at right now who has hundreds of workers in one town on opioids. And they're not on real high doses, so he's skimming below the surface. But they're all dependent. And who knows how many of them are addicted, because you can't really tell most of the time. That's another lesson for today. You don't really know in most cases among people on chronic opioids whether they're dependent or whether they have opioid use disorder, because there's no clear-cut test. And most of these patients in chronic pain getting their drugs from their doctors are not going to, they're still going to be able to get more and more from their doctors if they say they need it. And you don't know, they're not going to meet the DSM-5 criteria for opioid use disorder. So we looked at, because our workers get Social Security offsets, and we can tell in our system if they are on Social Security disability because they're getting an offset if they're on time loss. And we just looked at the percent of compensable claims that ended up on SSDI a certain number of years after, and you can see that looking at a 1997 cohort and a 2007 cohort, the percent that are increasingly permanently disabled is going up dramatically. I'm glad there's an actuary here. I always need an interpreter to talk to an actuary. I don't know why. These are the time loss durations. I love your slides, by the way. How do you get them to swoop around like that? This is our time loss duration. This is our time loss duration from our actuaries going back to the early 1970s. And there was a big increase in time loss duration at some point, but for the most part, during the 80s and 90s, everything was stable, pretty stable. So starting at about 1999, the time loss duration started going through the roof. In 1999 was when Washington State liberalized its opioid prescribing laws, like a lot of other states did. This is an ecological thing. It just happened at the same time. How is it related? It's related because if you get opioids for even just a few days, as the CDC has shown in some publications, you're going to become dependent. Few days to a few weeks. So I'll be talking later about how important it is to prevent the transition from acute to chronic opioids in the workers' comp system. So we have spent a lot of time, and Ohio's doing a lot, on trying to make sure that workers do not transition from acute to chronic opioid use when it is unnecessary and inappropriate. So we spend a lot of time in Washington doing reviews at 6 weeks among workers who got an opioid during the first weeks. And we have had a dramatic decline because of these reviews, because we won't allow opioids to go beyond 6 weeks unless the doctor says, well, there's been clinically meaningful improvement in function. And they're doing all these other things that they should be doing according to best practices on using opioids. So we've had, back in 2007, if a worker got an opioid in our system, 7.5% went on to chronic opioid use. That's the number you need to look at in your systems. What percent are going on to chronic opioid use who, given that they got a prescription in the first weeks after the injury, and that's where most workers start on opioids. It's the first or second visit. Of course, if they get surgery, it's another thing. So now it's down to under 1% in our system. Under 1% among those who got an opioid in the beginning are still getting opioids during 6 to 12 weeks. So we've had a dramatic decline because of our prospective review programs in the transition. And we just published this paper. It's again a kind of an ecological study. It's not the strongest science in the world. But we've had a dramatic reversal in the disability associated with the patients that were on opioids. And for the first time in the last 2 years, we have given a huge amount of rebate back to employers and workers on their premiums. And I believe the same thing has happened in Ohio. Is that right?
That's correct.
So this is a proof of principle issue that if opioids are related to the initiation and perpetuation of disability, you'd expect that if you reduce the amount being given acutely and then reduce the transition to chronic opioid use, you will also have a strong relationship with a reversal of long-term trends in disability. And that's what we think we've had. Of course, there are many other things happening here. My boss goes, well, why isn't there return to work programs? This and that. I agree with all that. You can't really sort it all out. But I'm 100% sure that opioids have contributed a large portion of that. In my next few slides, that's going to come later.
That'll come at the
Okay.
end parts, though. I got them all together. So.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Franklin. Next up, we're going to have Benoit Dumoulin.